In the heart of a city ruled by shadows and greed, the criminals who held sway saw him as nothing more than a mark alone, wealthy man with a car worth stealing and a life they could disrupt without consequence. To them, he was an easy target, a man whose solitude made him vulnerable, whose dog was just collateral damage in their reckless game. They had preyed on others before, men who knew better than to resist, men who bowed to fear. But this man was different. They couldn't see the weight of his past, the scars etched into his silence, or the lethal precision buried beneath his unassuming existence. They didn't know the dog they so carelessly killed was more than a pet. It was a lifeline, the last gift from a woman he had loved and lost, the fragile thread tying him to a life of peace he had fought to build. They didn't realize he was a ghost from a world of blood and vengeance. A retired assassin who had once left a trail of bodies in his wake before vanishing into the obscurity of a quiet life. By the time they understood their mistake, it was too late. They had taken the only thing he had left, and in return, he would dismantle their world piece by piece. The city sprawled before Elias Kane like a restless beast, its neon lights flickering against the night sky, casting long shadows across the asphalt. The low growl of his 1969 Mustang hummed beneath his hands, a machine as disciplined and deadly as the man behind the wheel. His grip on the steering wheel was relaxed but ready, his eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. For the past 10 minutes, a car had been trailing him. At first, he dismissed it as coincidence. Late-night drivers weren't uncommon in a city that never slept. But as the minutes ticked by, the pattern became undeniable. They weren't just sharing the road, they were hunting him. To test his suspicion, Elias made a sharp right onto a narrow side street, his movements deliberate but casual. The car followed. He wove through 2 lanes past a shuttered gas station, and they stayed on his tail. His jaw tightened, and something primal stirred within him, a flicker of the instincts he had spent years suppressing. Those instincts never truly faded. No matter how long he tried to bury them, he made 3 more turns, each one sharper, each one designed to shake a casual driver. The tail didn't falter. They weren't amateurs, but they weren't skilled enough to hide their intent. Who were they? A warning from his past, a random act of greed, a ghost come to collect? The answer didn't matter. Not yet. A long, desolate stretch of road opened up ahead, cloaked in darkness. Elias exhaled, slow and controlled, and pressed the accelerator. The Mustang surged forward, its engine roaring as the tires bit into the pavement. The trailing car tried to match his speed, but they hesitated for a fraction of a second, enough for Elias to act. He killed the headlights, veered onto an unlit side street, and slammed on the brakes, sliding the car into the shadows between 2 rusted delivery trucks. The pursuing car sped past, their headlights sweeping the empty road, searching for a man who had already become a phantom. From the darkness, Elias watched them, his breath steady, his mind razor-sharp. He waited, letting the silence settle, then eased the Mustang back onto the road and drove home. He had lost them for now, but the weight in his chest told him this wasn't over. The drive back to his cabin should have been routine, a quiet retreat to the solitude he had grown accustomed to. The city's chaos no longer had a hold on him, and the hum of the Mustang's engine was a familiar comfort. But tonight something felt wrong, not in a way he could pinpoint, but in the subtle shift of the air, the way a predator senses a threat before it appears. He had shaken the tail in the city, but experience taught him that didn't mean he was safe. As he pulled into the gravel driveway, his headlights swept over the cabin's weathered exterior, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. He cut the engine, and there on the porch was his dog, ears pricked, eyes gleaming in the dark. The dog was always like that, sensing things Elias hadn't yet noticed, a partner in survival rather than just a companion. Elias stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel, and the dog trotted to his side, brushing against his leg with a warmth that grounded him. It was a ritual, one that usually brought a fleeting sense of peace. But tonight, anon, that peace felt out of reach, replaced by a pressure he couldn't shake. The moment he crossed the threshold into the cabin, he knew something was wrong. The air inside was different, thicker, tinged with the faint scent of leather and sweat. There was a sound, too soft to be noticed by most, but unmistakable to him, the quiet exhale of someone trying to hide in the dark. His movements remained calm, deliberate. He closed the door, locked it, and placed his keys on the counter, all while his senses mapped the room. The dog followed, its tail no longer wagging, its body tense. Then a voice cut through the silence, young and dripping with arrogance. "Damn, this place is nice. Bet it cost a fortune." Elias didn't react immediately. He exhaled slowly, his fingers brushing the handle of a knife he kept hidden beneath the counter's edge. He turned to face the intruders, three men standing near the hallway, dressed in leather jackets and dark jeans. Their postures too relaxed for men invading another's home. The one in the center, clearly the leader, surveyed the cabin with a smirk, his eyes lingering on the furniture before settling on Elias. "Saw your car out front," he said, his voice laced with mockery. "Didn't expect some old guy to own something that sweet." Elias studied them, piecing together the situation. These weren't professionals, not men sent with a purpose. They were thieves, reckless and entitled, drawn to the Mustang's gleam and the assumption that its owner would be an easy mark. "Keys," the leader said, extending a hand. "Now." Elias didn't move, his gaze steady, unyielding. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed the leader's face, not fear, but the unease of someone who expected submission and found defiance instead. "That's not happening," Elias said, his voice low, calm, like the still surface of a lake hiding a current beneath. One of the men scoffed. "Come on, man, don't make this hard." The leader, Luca, Elias guessed from the way the others deferred to him, tilted his head, his smirk returning, but less confident now. "I'm trying to be nice here. Could have just taken what I wanted and been gone before you noticed. But I'm giving you a chance. Hand over the keys, and we keep this civil." Elias shifted slightly, his hand still near the knife. "You don't belong here," he said. "You have no idea what you're doing." Luca's grin widened, but it was forced, a mask for the doubt creeping in. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing. You, on the other hand, don't seem to get how this works. That car, it's mine now. Give me the keys, and this stays easy." The dog growled, stepping forward, its muscles coiled. Luca glanced at it, rolling his eyes. "Seriously, you're going to play tough with your mutt?" Elias's pulse remained steady, his mind clear. He had spent years running from the man he used to be, choosing peace over bloodshed. But peace was a fragile thing, and men like Luca didn't understand the cost of shattering it. Luca sighed, his patience thinning, and pulled a pistol from his jacket, letting it dangle loosely at his side. His grip was sloppy, his finger nowhere near the trigger, an amateur's mistake. He pointed the gun at Elias, but the dog took another step, its growl deepening, the fur along its spine bristling. Luca's expression hardened. "Oh, for Don't," Elias said, the words sharp, carrying a weight that wasn't a plea or a threat but a warning born of certainty. Luca hesitated, his eyes flicking between Elias and the dog. Then he laughed, turning to his men. "You believe this guy? Some old man thinks he's—" Elias moved, his hand closed around the knife, the motion fluid, instinctive. He stepped forward, the blade flashing, but a fist slammed into his side harder and faster than he'd expected. The third man had moved, catching him off guard just enough to throw off his strike. The impact knocked him slightly off balance, and in that moment, the second man grabbed his wrist, twisting until the knife clattered to the floor. It was a mistake they wouldn't recover from. Elias didn't need a weapon. He drove an elbow into the throat of the man who'd struck him, feeling the crunch of cartilage as the man staggered back. Gasping, twisting free, Elias slammed a fist into the second man's ribs, the crack of bone echoing in the small room. The fight had erupted, the illusion of control shattering as Luca's men lunged at him. They had numbers, and that made them bold. But boldness wasn't enough against a man like Elias. One reached for him, but Elias sidestepped, using the man's momentum to send him crashing into the wall. Luca raised the gun, his hands shaking now, but Elias was already closing the distance, his movements a blur of precision and purpose. The wooden table shuddered under the force of a fist slamming into it, the impact sending glasses and plates rattling like a warning. Elias barely had time to register the first man's aggression before the second was already charging from the side, his fist swinging in a wild, untrained arc aimed at Elias's ribs. The punch wasn't clean, but it was heavy, landing with a dull thud that sent a sharp spike of pain through his side. It was a brutal reminder that time had carved its own tally into his body, that he wasn't the younger man who once shrugged off blows like they were nothing. But pain was no stranger. It was just a signal, a fleeting message to acknowledge and push through. Instead of bracing against the hit, Elias flowed with it, letting the momentum carry him out of the path of a second strike. The man, over-yagged and off balance, left himself open for a split second, and that was all Elias needed. With a quick pivot, he stepped inside the man's reach, delivering two precise strikes to the solar plexus, each one stealing the air from his lungs. An elbow snapped upward, catching the man's jaw with a crack. The attacker staggered back, dazed, but there was no time to savor the moment the third man was already moving. Before Elias could fully reset, an arm snaked around his throat. The chokehold clumsy but strong. Instinct kicked in. His hand shot up, gripping the arm, while he tucked his chin to keep the pressure from cutting off his air. He had seconds before the hold became a real problem. The man behind him leaned in, trying to use his weight to drag Elias backward. And for a moment, the edges of Elias's vision began to blur, his muscles burning under the strain. But he adjusted, shifting his stance, bending his knees to find leverage. With a sudden burst of force, he drove the back of his head into the man's face, the impact sending a jolt through his skull. A sickening crunch followed, along with a grunt of pain as the grip loosened. Elias didn't hesitate. Dropping his weight, he twisted free and slammed an elbow into the man's ribs. The attacker doubled over, and Elias finished it with two strikes, one to the side of the head, another to the throat. The man collapsed, out cold. That left the last one, the first to land a hit. He was back on his feet now, a switchblade gleaming in his hand, held with the kind of cocky assurance that told Elias he'd used it before, but never against someone like him. Near the door, Luca stood watching, his earlier smirk replaced by something colder, more calculating. Elias could see the gears turning in his mind, the subtle flex of his fingers near the gun at his hip, the shift in his stance. He was starting to realize this wasn't the fight he'd thought it would be. Elias turned his focus to the man with the knife. The blade slashed forward, fast and vicious, aimed for his gut. Elias sidestepped, the steel slicing through empty air, and moved in before the man could recover. Grabbing the wrist, he twisted hard, forcing the knife to clatter to the floor. A sharp strike to the throat followed, then one to the knee, buckling the man's leg. As he crumpled, Elias delivered a final blow to the back of his skull. The cabin fell silent, save for the ragged breathing of the men sprawled across the floor. Luca hadn't moved, but the arrogance was gone from his face. Elias faced him, his breath steady despite the fight, his body still coiled, ready. He saw it in Luca's eyes, the flicker of understanding, the weight of a mistake settling in. Luca wasn't a fighter, not really. He was just a reckless kid who thought himself untouchable. "You're not just some guy," Luca muttered, his voice tinged with something new hesitation. It was almost laughable. Luca had walked into this cabin believing he held all the cards. Now he was scrambling for an exit. Elias took a slow step forward, and that was enough. Luca's hand darted for his gun, fumbling for a half-second too long. He turned sharply toward the door, his plan unraveling. This wasn't about stealing the car anymore. It was about survival. But before he fled, Luca did something Elias hadn't anticipated. A single shot rang out, sharp and deafening, shattering the air. Elias's world tilted. The Duane, loyal and fearless, had been moving toward Luca, ready to protect its owner at any cost. The bullet caught it in the chest, and its body hit the floor with a sickening thud. Everything else faded. Luca didn't wait to see the aftermath. He was already running. the cabin door slamming open as his boots pounded the dirt outside. The Mustang's engine roared to life, tires spitting gravel as it tore down the road. Elias could have chased him. He could have ripped Luca from the driver's seat, ended it right there. But his feet wouldn't move. The weight of the moment pressed into his chest, heavy and unyielding. He sank to his knees beside the dog, his fingers hovering over the soft fur, now still and growing cold. His breath felt wrong, too shallow, too strained. His hands, steady through the fight, trembled now, though he couldn't name the feeling tearing through him. It wasn't grief, not in the way most people knew it. It was something deeper, colder, an absence that swallowed everything. This wasn't just a dog. It had never been just a dog. Memories unspooled in his mind, slow and deliberate, like a wound reopening. He saw Isabella, her smile bright enough to light up the darkest corners of his world. She'd brought the puppy home one day, cradling it in her arms as she stood in their doorway. "It's for you," she'd said, her voice warm, insistent. He'd frowned, shaking his head. "I don't need a dog." But she'd stepped closer, placing the tiny, wriggling creature in his arms. "It's not about need," she'd countered, her eyes holding his. "It's about learning to live with something that loves you unconditionally." He hadn't understood then, not fully, but Isabella had. She'd seen the scars he carried, the life he'd led before her, a life of precision, of violence, of being a weapon honed to perfection. Where others saw a killer, she saw a man worth saving. And for a time, he'd believed her. The dog had become part of their life, a quiet, constant presence in the home they'd built. It was a warmth in a world that had always felt cold to him. He'd never spoken of what it meant, never found the words to capture how it anchored him after Isabella was gone. Her death had come too fast. One day, her laughter filled their home, her touch grounding him like nothing else ever had. The next, she was in a hospital bed, her body frail, the light in her eyes fading. He'd sat beside her, holding her hand, silent and helpless as the inevitable loomed. When she was gone, the weight of her absence had nearly broken him. The only thing that kept him from slipping back into the darkness was the dog, the last gift she'd given him, the last tether to the life they'd shared. Now that tether was gone, Elias inhaled, the air thick and heavy in his lungs. His fingers brushed the dog's fur, gentle in a way he hadn't been in years. This wasn't sorrow, not the kind that spilled into tears or demanded comfort. It was a quiet, merciless cold that settled into his bones. The man who'd lived in this cabin, who'd tried to carve out a sliver of peace, was gone. In his place was something older, something ruthless. Luca had taken the car, but he'd stolen something far more precious, and Elias Kane would make him pay for it every last debt, collected in full. Kneeling in the dim light of the cabin, the world blurring at the edges, Elias's gaze fixed on the still form before him. His hands hovered, unwilling to touch, unwilling to confirm the truth. The warmth was gone, the loyal eyes empty. For the first time in years, he hesitated, his body and mind caught in the weight of what had been taken. But beneath the silence, something stirred, something buried deep, something he'd sworn would never rise again. A slow breath, a heartbeat, then stillness. The reckoning was coming. Elias stood motionless in the dim light of his home, his breath slow and deliberate. Each exhale a quiet release of the storm brewing inside him. Grief, for him, had always been a tangible thing, not some fleeting emotion, but a weight, a force that shaped itself into violence. His eyes drifted to the faint streak of blood smeared across the hardwood floor, the last echo of the struggle that had unfolded here. It was all that remained of the men who had dared to cross his threshold, believing they could take something from him. They had been wrong. Luca had been wrong. With a measured slowness, Elias rose from his chair, his body heavy with the weight of what had happened, but his mind sharpening, honing itself into something cold and deadly. The hesitation, the stillness that had briefly held him back, was gone now, replaced by a familiar clarity, a purpose that felt like slipping into an old, well-worn coat. He crossed the room, stepping over the lifeless bodies sprawled on the floor without a second glance. They didn't matter. They had never mattered. They were nothing more than obstacles, minor inconveniences in the face of what was coming next. Luca had left him no choice. Elias knelt beside the floorboards, his fingers tracing the nearly invisible seam of a hidden compartment. With a gentle press, the wood gave way, sliding open to reveal a sleek, black case nestled within. He lifted it carefully, the weight of it grounding him, a tether to a past he had tried so hard to bury. The metal locks clicked open under his touch, and as he raised the lid, the faint glow of the room's single bulb glinted off the weapons inside. Each one was pristine, meticulously maintained despite the years. A silent testament to the truth he had always known. Deep down, peace was never his to keep. He reached for the handgun first, its familiar weight settling into his palm like a handshake from an old friend. Then came the extra magazines, the knife, the tools of a life he had sworn he had left behind. He had tried to walk away, to become something else, something better. But men like him weren't built for quiet lives. Luca had taken more than just his car. That wasn't the crime. The crime was stealing the last piece of Isabella's world, the final fragment of her that Elias had clung to. For that, Luca would lose everything. Elias moved with precision, sliding the gun into its holster, securing the knives, his hands steady and methodical. He was stepping back into a world he had always belonged to, a world where hesitation was death and mercy was a luxury he could no longer afford. Tomorrow, he would find the first name on his list. By the end of the week, Luca's men would be gone, and soon Luca himself would learn what it meant to be hunted. The city at night was a living thing, pulsing with secrets that daylight could never uncover. Its streets hummed with the quiet deals and whispered promises of those who thrived in the shadows. Elias moved through it like a ghost, his steps sure and silent, as if he had never left this world behind. He had sworn he was done with it, vowed to never return. But oaths were fragile things when the past refused to stay buried. Luca Saleri, the name meant nothing to him. The kid had stood in Elias's home, brash and entitled, a gun in his hand and men at his back, acting like he owned the world. Cocky, untouchable. But Elias didn't know him, and that was unusual. Back when he was part of this life, Elias had known every name worth knowing, who they worked for, how they operated, how long they'd last before the city swallowed them whole. Luca was either a new player or someone's dirty secret, kept quiet for too long. And if there was one thing Elias had learned in his years among killers, it was that there was always someone who knew more than they should. The bar was exactly the kind of place where those secrets lived. Tucked into a forgotten corner of the city, it was old and unassuming, its dim lights casting long shadows over booths where no one dared to look too closely. Deals were made here, cloaked in the guise of casual conversation, and the air was thick with the weight of things unsaid. Elias hadn't been here in years, but as he stepped inside, the familiar smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke hit him like a memory. Nothing had changed, not the place, and not the man behind the counter. Marcus Vale, he had been Elias's contact back when information was the difference between life and death, when knowing the right thing at the right time meant walking away instead of bleeding out in some alley. Marcus wasn't an informant in the traditional sense. He was a man who made it his business to know everything: who was rising, who was falling, who was about to meet their end. More importantly, Bieta, he knew who needed to hear it. Tonight, Elias was that man. The door swung shut behind him, drawing a few fleeting glances from the other patrons before they returned to their drinks. Marcus was at the bar, wiping down a glass with the same calm detachment he'd always had, as if nothing in the world could rattle him. But when he looked up and saw Elias standing there, something flickered in his eyes: recognition, maybe, or the faintest trace of weariness. "Well," Marcus muttered, setting the glass down with a soft clink, "didn't think I'd be seeing you again." Elias pulled out a stool and sat, his silence louder than words. Marcus studied him for a moment, then sighed, reaching for a bottle and pouring 2 glasses without asking, I'm guessing this ain't a social call. Elias lifted the glass, letting its weight settle in his hand before speaking. I need a name. Marcus smirked, shaking his head. You always do. He leaned against the counter, his eyes narrowing slightly. But I get the feeling this one's personal. Elias exhaled through his nose, taking a slow sip before setting the glass down. Luca Saleri. Tell me about him. Marcus's expression didn't change, but Elias caught the subtle shift in his posture, the way his shoulders tensed just enough to betray his unease. Huh, Marcus murmured, reaching for his own glass. That's a name I didn't think I'd hear coming out of your mouth. Elias waited, his gaze steady. Marcus took a sip, then set his glass down with a quiet clink. Kid's the son of Victor Saleri. You remember Victor? Elias nodded once, his face unreadable. Marcus let out a short breath. Yeah, well, the old man used to be sharp, smart, ran things clean, kept the blood off the streets as much as he could. But Luca, he's different. Grew up in his father's shadow, but he's got none of the discipline, none of the instincts. Thinks he can do whatever he wants just because of who his father is. Victor's tried to keep him out of real trouble, but you know how that goes. Elias did know. Men like Luca burned bright and fast, making enemies they couldn't outrun, trusting people who'd sell them out for a dime. They thought they were untouchable until the world proved them wrong. And now, Elias was going to prove it. Why are you asking? Marcus said after a pause, his gaze sharper now. You don't just come back for something like this. What did he do? Elias could have answered, could have given voice to the loss that still burned inside him, but the words felt too heavy, too final. Instead, he lifted the glass to his lips again, letting the silence speak for him. Marcus watched him, then sighed, leaning in slightly and lowering his voice. Word is, Luca's hiding out at the docks. His father set him up with a safe house after he pulled something reckless a couple nights ago. I don't know what, and I don't think Victor does either, because if he did, that kid would already be dead. Elias set his glass down, rolling his wrist slightly as the information settled. Marcus studied him for a moment longer, then shook his head. You're not going to let this go, are you? Elias met his gaze, his eyes cold and resolute. No. Marcus exhaled, a quiet acknowledgement of the inevitable. Then I hope you're ready for what's coming. Elias pushed the glass forward slightly, a silent gesture of thanks, then stood. He had what he needed. The first step in a hunt was always knowing where to start, and now he did. The safe house was a fortress of discretion, hidden in the quiet outskirts of the docks where rusting shipping containers and crumbling warehouses guarded secrets better than any man could. It was a place designed to make someone disappear, to exist just beyond the city's reach, where names were irrelevant and survival depended on staying unseen. Victor Saleri had chosen it carefully, a refuge he'd used before when things needed to be kept quiet, when debts were collected, when lines were crossed, when the city's watchful eyes needed to be avoided. But tonight, as Victor's car rolled to a stop on the gravel outside, a strange unease settled over him, a feeling he hadn't known in years. Dread. It hung in the air, thick and oppressive, sinking into his bones before his mind could fully grasp why. He knew, without needing to be told, that something was wrong. His driver stepped out first, scanning the perimeter with a practiced eye, but Victor knew there would be nothing to see. If there was a threat, it wouldn't be waiting outside. It would be inside, patient and inevitable. Victor exhaled slowly, steadying himself as he stepped out of the car, the weight of his coat shifting against the pistol holstered at his side. A small comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. Earlier that day, Luca had called him, his voice clipped and unsteady, rattled in a way Victor had never heard before. His son had done something reckless, something stupid, and now he was holed up here, waiting for his father to clean up the mess. It was always the same story. Victor entered without knocking, the air inside thick with the stale scent of cigarette smoke and the sharp tang of cheap whiskey. Luca sat at a small kitchen table, a half-empty glass in front of him, a bottle within reach. He didn't look up as his father stepped inside, but the way his fingers tightened around the edge of the table spoke volumes. Victor stood in the doorway, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene, the weight of his son's silence heavier than any words could have been. Whatever Luca had done, it was worse than he'd let on, and whatever was coming, it was already here. Victor's voice cut through the dim light of the room, steady but laced with a gravity that made the air feel heavier. "Tell me, Luca," he said, each word deliberate, as if he were laying down a challenge. Luca let out a sharp breath, dragging a hand across his stubbled jaw before meeting his father's gaze. "It was nothing," he muttered, his tone dismissive, like he was brushing off a minor inconvenience. "Just some old guy. We took his car. That's all." Victor didn't respond immediately. He stood there, motionless, letting the silence stretch until it felt like a living thing pressing against the walls. Luca shifted in his chair, the creak of the wood loud in the quiet. He got in the way. "Okay," Luca added, his voice rising slightly, as if daring Victor to push back. "I told him to hand over the keys. He didn't, so we dealt with it. End of story." The words spilled out carelessly, weightless, as if they described nothing more than a bar fight or a petty theft. Victor's eyes narrowed, a glint of something dangerous flickering in them. "Dealt with it how?" he asked, his voice low, each syllable sharp enough to cut. Luca scoffed, shaking his head like the question was absurd. "We roughed him up, left him there, took the car." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "Oh, and we shot his dog." The room seemed to freeze, the silence so absolute it was as if the world itself had paused to catch its breath. Victor's face remained unreadable, but the air shifted, growing dense with an unspoken weight. Luca frowned, unsettled by the stillness, and leaned forward. What he demanded, his voice tinged with a nervous edge. Victor didn't answer. He turned slightly, bracing his hands against the worn countertop, his head dipping as if he were trying to anchor himself against a storm only he could see. Luca let out a short, uneasy laugh. "What? Dad? Why are you acting like this?" "Say it again," Victor murmured, his voice quieter now, but with an edge that felt like it could shatter glass. Luca blinked, caught off guard. "What?" Victor spun to face him, his eyes locking onto Luca's with an intensity that felt almost otherworldly cold, distant, and for the first time in Luca's life, terrifying. "Whose car?" Victor asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Luca hesitated, his earlier bravado faltering. Some guys," he said, his throat suddenly dry. Elias Kiney. I think." Victor closed his eyes, and for a moment there was nothing, no sound, no movement, just the suffocating weight of that name filling the space between them. When he exhaled, it was slow, controlled, as if he were trying to hold back something too vast to contain. He opened his eyes, and when he looked at Luca, there was no anger, no rage, just a quiet, devastating acceptance. "You shot his dog," he said, the words flat, final. Luca flinched, his back pressing against the chair. "I didn't, okay. Yeah, we did. But it was just a dog, Dad." Victor didn't let him finish. He turned back to the counter, his fingers gripping the edge so tightly his knuckles whitened. "Luca," he said, his voice hollow, stripped of its usual strength. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Luca forced a laugh, but it came out brittle, nervous. "Jesus. Dad, it was a dog, not just a dog." Victor's voice rose, sharp and sudden, cutting through the room like a blade. Luca froze, his breath catching. Victor took a step forward, his face still unreadable, but his eyes burning with something Luca couldn't name. "Do you know who Elias Khan is?" Luca swallowed hard, his confidence crumbling. "Some nobody, right?" Victor shook his head, his voice dropping to a near whisper, heavy with dread. "No, Luca, he's not a nobody. He's a man you don't cross, a man you don't steal from, a man you don't take from, because when you do, He doesn't just come for you, he erases you. Luca's mouth opened, but no words came. Victor stepped back, rubbing a hand over his face. His movements slow, deliberate, as if he were trying to keep himself from unraveling. God help us, he murmured, and for the first time in decades, Victor Soleri felt the cold grip of fear. Lucas sat there, the weight of his father's words sinking into him, but his pride refused to let him back down. He scoffed, shaking his head, trying to shake off the unease coiling in his gut. You're overreacting. Dad, the guy was just some... Shut up. Victor's voice wasn't loud, but it sliced through the air with a precision that made Luca's jaw snap shut. There was no anger in it, no heat, just a chilling finality that told Luca this wasn't like the other times. Victor wasn't angry, he was terrified. Victor turned slowly, gripping the back of a wooden chair, his knuckles pale against the dark wood. His breathing was steady but forced, as if he were holding something darker than at bay. You were inside his house, he said, his voice low, controlled. Luca shifted uncomfortably, his bravado slipping further. Yeah, so, and what did he do, Victor asked, his eyes boring into his son's. Luca let out a humorless chuckle, rubbing his hands over his jeans. Nothing, that's what I've been saying. He just sat there. I told him to give me the keys. He didn't, so we handled it. Took the car, left him there. Sure, he got a few hits in when things got rough. But come on, he was just some old... The slap came without warning. Not wild or furious, but deliberate. Controlled a statement. Luca's head snapped to the side, his cheek burning, his breath catching in his throat. He blinked, stunned, his hand rising to his face as he slowly turned back to his father, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Victor's voice was even, almost eerily calm. You mean to tell me you stood in Elias Kane's house, beat him in his ruin, stole from him, killed his dog, and left him alive? Luca's jaw tightened, the sting of the slap still pulsing. Yeah, he said, his voice quieter now, defiant but shaken. Victor let out a low, humorless chuckle, shaking his head, and now 3 of my men are dead. Luca's breath hitched, his body tensing. What? Victor tilted his head, watching his son's expression shift. You didn't know that, did you? He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. They found them tonight, scattered across the city. 2 in an alley, another in his own apartment. No struggle, no screams, just gone. Lucas swallowed, his earlier confidence dissolving. That could have been anyone. No, Luca, Victor said, his voice cold, final. It couldn't. Lucas shifted in his seat, his mind racing back to that night the way Elias had watched him, not with fear or anger, but with a calm, calculating stillness, like a predator sizing up its prey. Victor paced now, his movements sharp, his mind already spinning through what had to come next. You think he didn't fight back because he was weak? You think he let you do what you did because he couldn't stop you? Luca didn't answer, his stomach twisting. He let you do it, Victor said, his voice low, because he was deciding whether you were worth killing right then and there. And now that he's decided, he shook his head, his expression grim. Now he's hunting. Luca's pulse quickened, a cold sweat prickling at the back of his neck. I can fix this, he said, his voice tinged with desperation. Victor's eyes met his, and for a moment, there was only silence. Good, he said finally, but not for you. Luca's body went rigid. What? Victor didn't answer. He reached for his phone, his movements deliberate, and began dialing. Luca's stomach dropped. Dad, what are you doing? Victor lifted the phone to his ear, pacing slightly as the call connected. Put out the contract, he said, his voice steady. 5 million. I want every man worth a damn to know it's him or us. Luca's pulse pounded in his ears. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. Jesus, you're serious. You're putting a hit on him. Victor lowered the phone, his eyes locking onto his son's. I'm not putting out a hit. Luca, I'm buying us time. Luca shook his head, panic creeping into his voice. You're acting like he's some kind of monster. He is, Victor snapped, his voice sharp, final. He stepped closer, his patience fraying. You don't kill a man like Elias Cain. Luca, you slow him down. You throw enough bodies in his way to give us time to find a way out. Luca stared at him, his chest tight. And if we can't, Victor exhaled, his voice steady but heavy, as if the words themselves were a sentence. Then we die. The city had always been a place of quiet violence, where power shifted not in loud, bloody battles, but in the shadows and men vanishing without a sound, their names whispered in dark corners before they were forgotten. Tonight, Fabad, that silence had been shattered. Elias Cain stood beneath the flickering glow of a streetlight, the cool night air brushing against his skin. His eyes were steady, unyielding, as they traced the faint streaks of blood staining the cuff of his sleeve. At his feet lay the last of the three men Victor had spoken of, his body curled against the damp pavement, lifeless, his breath stolen by the night. The first had been easy. Elias had watched him for days, learning his habits, his routines predictable. Like any man who thought himself untouchable, he'd slipped into the man's car outside a rundown club, waiting for the moment he was alone. The silencer pressed against the base of his skull, cold and final. No words, no struggle, just a single, quiet exhale, and then nothing. The first man never saw his end creeping up on him. The second, though, was different, wary, haunted by the ghost of the first's disappearance. Paranoia had taken root in him like a slow poison, driving him to fortify his small apartment in the heart of the city. Barricades blocked the doors, and a loaded pistol stayed within arm's reach. Every shadow made him flinch. Every creak set his heart racing. But Elias was a patient predator. He bided his time, watching, waiting for the perfect moment. When it came, he slipped through the fire escape window, silent as a wraith, moving through the darkened rooms with a grace that belied his lethal intent. By the time the man realized he wasn't alone, it was already over, his fight lost before it could even begin. The third man, the last of the trio, had been cleverer. He'd seen the pattern, sensed the hunter closing in. He tried to flee, his footsteps pounding through the city's underbelly, his breath ragged with desperation. But running had never saved anyone from Elias. In a narrow alley, under the flicker of a dying streetlight, Elias caught him. The man's voice cracked as he begged, "Please, I had no choice." His fear hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. Elias studied him, his gaze cold and unyielding, weighing the plea. After a long silence, he spoke softly, "Neither do I." With the third man gone, the message was clear. Those responsible were falling, one by one, like dominoes in a line. Only one remained: Luca, the architect of this chaos. Elias adjusted his coat, his mind already shifting to the next move. When the sound of footsteps broke his focus, he didn't react, didn't turn or stiffen. He knew that rhythm, the familiar cadence of someone who had once been a friend. "This is getting messy," Elias said, finally turning to face the figure stepping into the dim glow of a street lamp. Cal Morrison stood there, tall and lean, his dark clothes blending into the night. The brim of his hat cast shadows over his face. But Elias did not need to see it to know him. Cal had always walked a tightrope, broker of secrets, dealer in truths others preferred to keep buried. He'd made a career of staying just out of reach, useful but never truly loyal. Tonight, though, he was too close to the fire. Cal sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw before letting it fall. "I know what you're doing, Elias. Hell, the whole city's starting to piece it together." His eyes flicked to the body in the alley, then back to Elias. "And Victor, he's figured it out too." Elias remained silent, his expression unreadable. Cal let out a sharp breath. "They put a bounty on you. 5 million. The words landed heavily, but Elias didn't flinch. He'd known Victor wouldn't just wait for the axe to fall. Men like Victor calculating, ruthless, always fought to keep their grip on power, even when it was slipping through their fingers. Cal gave a humorless chuckle. 5 million's a lot of money. Plenty of people are itching to take a shot. Elias absorbed the news with the same icy calm he always carried. A bounty meant the city would turn on him now. Every desperate soul, every greedy fool who thought they could outmatch him, would crawl out of the shadows. It changed nothing. His path was set. Cal studied him, shaking his head. I gotta ask, man, is this really about the kid? Elias's gaze sharpened, and Cal raised a hand, as if to ward off the tension. I get it. They came into your home, took your car, killed your dog, but I've known you long enough to know that this isn't just about one bad night. So what's driving you? What's this really about? For a moment, Elias considered staying silent. Cal wasn't a threat, just a man trying to make sense of the storm before it swallowed him whole. Finally, Elias spoke, his voice low and steady. They took the last thing I had. I gave up everything for a shot at peace, and they burned it to the ground for nothing. Now they're going to learn what that kid. Cal was quiet, his face unreadable. Then he sighed, pulling a pack of cigarettes from his pocket. He tapped one out, sliding it between his lips but not lighting it. Lost in thought. You're going to need more than a gun this time, he said at last. Elias met his gaze, something cold and resolute flickering in his eyes. I know. Cal hesitated, then gave a slight nod. I can get you supplies, locations. But after that, he exhaled. We never spoke. Elias nodded slowly. Understood. Without another word, he turned, melting into the shadows. The weight of the bounty settled over the city like a storm cloud. Tomorrow, the hunters would come for him, and tomorrow, the first of them would fall. The city felt different when it was hunting. There was a tension in the air, a heaviness that clung to the streets. Conversations hushed when certain names were mentioned, and shadows seemed to linger just a little longer. Elias could feel it, the slow, inevitable pull of the noose tightening around him. Victor Sillery, the man behind the bounty, was no fool. Ruthless and meticulous, he didn't tolerate chaos in his world. A $5 million contract wasn't about killing Elias. It was about slowing him down, throwing bodies in his path to buy Victor time to escape the reckoning headed his way. But Victor had miscalculated. Elias didn't slow down. In a dimly lit motel room, with the distant hum of the freeway seeping through the walls, Elias prepared. His hands moved with quiet precision, checking the weight of his pistol, attaching a suppressor, and tucking it into the holster beneath his coat. He'd felt the shift the moment the bounty was announced, seen it in the faces of strangers on the street, their glances lingering too long, their eyes calculating. The hunters were already here. 6 of them, moving with a confidence born of numbers, believing they had the upper hand. They were careful, staying just out of sight, waiting for their moment. They didn't know their moment had already passed. Elias stood, rolling his shoulders as he exhaled, letting the weight of the coming fight settle over him. Outside, the city pulsed with life, sirens wailed in the distance. Neon signs flickered against rain-slicked pavement, and music drifted through the alleys. The city didn't care about the bloodshed on its horizon. It never did. He stepped onto the street, moving with a calm that came from knowing exactly how this would unfold. He didn't rush or hide. He waited, and they came to him. The first was careless, trying to blend into the crowd but betraying himself with deliberate steps and a too-controlled posture. Elias didn't acknowledge him, just listened to the man's breathing hitch as the others closed in, herding Elias toward an empty alley. They thought they were in control, thought they were leading him into a trap. Elias let them believe it. He stepped into the alley, slowing just enough to let the city's noise fade behind him. Footsteps echoed behind, to the side, then ahead. They had him surrounded. Elias stopped, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the leader emerged, a man with a scar slicing across his cheek and a smirk dripping with overconfidence. He'd killed before, but he'd never faced a fight like this. You know why we're here, the man said, tilting his head, hands resting casually at his sides, too relaxed, too sure. Elias lifted his gaze, meeting the man's eyes, saying nothing. The smirk widened. 5 million's a hell of a number. Makes a man wonder if he should just turn himself in. Elias didn't respond. The man nodded, exhaling through his nose. Yeah, didn't think so. The first attacker lunged, and that was all it took. Elias moved like water, sidestepping smoothly, his hands snapping out to seize the man's wrist. A sharp twist sent the man's gun skittering across the pavement, and Elias drove an elbow into his ribs, the air leaving his lungs in a broken gasp. The second was quicker, a knife glinting under the streetlights, but Elias was already in motion. He ducked beneath the blade, stepping into the man's space and driving a knee into his stomach, sending him crashing against the alley wall. The leader reacted, pulling his gun, but Elias was faster. He closed the distance before the barrel could rise, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it outward, forcing the muzzle into the man's own chest. A sharp, calculated shove slammed him against the brick wall, his confidence crumbling. The others hesitated, the air thick with their sudden doubt. They hadn't expected this, not the speed, not the precision. The fourth man turned to run. Elias let him go. There would be time for him later. For now, the alley was quiet again. The storm momentarily stilled, but the city was watching, and the hunt was far from over. In the dim, flickering light of a city that never truly slept, Elias Kane stood as a specter of retribution, a man whose name was whispered in fear by those who dared to cross him. The leader of the failed ambush leaned heavily against a crumbling brick wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps, hands trembling like leaves in a storm. Elias pressed the cold steel of his pistol against the man's ribs, the weight of it a silent promise. "Tell them," Elias murmured, his voice low, almost a whisper, yet carrying the weight of a thunderclap. "Tell them what you saw." The man swallowed hard, his pulse hammering beneath sweat-slicked skin, nodding stiffly as if his life depended on it, because it did. Elias stepped back, his eyes cold and unyielding, watching as the remnants of the group scrambled to their feet, dragging their wounded into the shadows of the night. Their failure clung to them, heavy as iron, and by dawn the city would know the first wave had come for Elias Kane, and the first wave had fallen. Elias adjusted his worn coat, rolling his shoulders as if shrugging off the weight of the encounter. He melted back into the labyrinthine streets, his steps deliberate, unhurried, as though the chaos of the night was nothing more than a passing inconvenience. Tomorrow, more would come. Tomorrow, more would learn the truth of who he was: a predator, not prey, a man who could not be hunted. In the heart of the city, Victor Salieri's study was a fortress of silence, the kind that pressed against the walls and seeped into the bones. The room was bathed in the faint amber glow of a liquor cabinet, casting long, jagged shadows across the polished, mahogany desk where Victor sat, his fingers steepled, his face a mask of unreadable calm. The air was thick, not with comfort, but with the weight of unspoken words, the kind that could choke a man before he ever drew breath to speak. The night before, 6 men had been sent to hunt Elias Kane. 5 had been broken, dismantled like toys in a child's tantrum. The 6th had stumbled back, his breath uneven, hands shaking as he recounted the nightmare, how they'd tried to corner Elias, how they'd believed they had the upper hand, how in less than 2 minutes, their illusion of control had been shattered. Victor's most trusted men stood before him, their voices hushed, threaded with something rare: hesitation, not yet fear, but close enough to taste. Luca, Victor's son, lounged in a leather chair to the side, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm against the armrest, his leg bouncing in a futile attempt to mask his unease. He wore indifference like a shield, but Victor knew him too well. The cracks were there, spiderwebbing beneath the surface, betraying the bravado he clung to. "This isn't working," one of the men said, his voice sharp with frustration, though carefully controlled. "We put the bounty out to slow him down, not to make him a legend, but that's exactly what's happening. Every time we send men after him, The city remembers who he is. Victor exhaled slowly, the sound measured, deliberate. He knew. The bounty hadn't tamed Elias, it had honed him, sharpened his edges, reminded the world that he was no ordinary man. He'd never been prey, only a predator who'd chosen. Until now, not to hunt. That choice was gone, stripped away by the price on his head. Luca scoffed, leaning back, his posture all forced nonchalance. So what? We just keep throwing bodies at him until he gets bored. Victor's gaze snapped to his son, heavy enough to still the nervous twitching of Luca's leg. No. Luca frowned, caught off guard. Then Victor leaned forward, his fingers tapping once against the desk. A small gesture that shifted the air in the room. We stop sending fools. The words landed like a blade, and the men before him stiffened, their attention sharpening. They understood. The bounty had drawn out the desperate mercenaries, opportunists, men who saw Elias Kane as just another name on a contract, a quick path to a payday. They'd believed brute force and numbers would be enough. They'd been wrong. Now, Victor was done with amateurs. He reached for his glass, the amber liquid catching the light as he swirled it, his eyes never leaving his men. No more hired guns, no more reckless fools chasing a paycheck. We do this right. He set the glass down with a deliberate clink. I'm sending in our own. The silence that followed was heavy, creeping into every corner of the room. Luca sat up, his bravado flickering for a moment before he caught himself. Wait, our guys. You mean? Victor nodded, and Luca let out a short, humorless laugh. Jesus, Dad, you're acting like we're at war. Victor's expression didn't waver. We are. Luca's lips parted, but no words came. One of the men stepped forward, his voice cautious. Which unit? Victor studied him, then raised a single finger. The Wolves. Luca inhaled sharply, his composure cracking just enough to betray him before he forced it back into place. The Wolves weren't just enforcers, they were Victor's elite. Men forged in the crucible of military and special forces training, their loyalty bought with blood. They didn't follow the same rules as the rest of the organization. They didn't hesitate, didn't question. They were hunters, methodical and unrelenting, and now they had a target. Luca forced another laugh, shaking his head as if trying to convince himself. Fine, sure, send them in. This guy's had his fun, but he's just one man. The Wolves will end him quick. Victor's eyes flicked to his son, and Luca met his gaze. But there was something there now, uncertainty, flickering just beneath the surface. Victor leaned forward, his voice calm but heavy. Do you believe that? Luca waved a hand, scoffing. Of course I do. Victor didn't respond, just watched as Luca shifted, gripping the arms of his chair a little tighter. Come on, Dad. Yeah, the guy's dangerous, but let's not pretend he's some unstoppable force. He's just... Victor exhaled, standing slowly, cutting Luca off without a word. He moved to the liquor cabinet, pouring another drink, letting the silence stretch, letting his son stew in his own bravado. Then, without turning, he spoke. The first time I met Elias Kane, he walked into a room with 12 men waiting to kill him. Luca swallowed, his fingers tapping nervously again. Victor took a slow sip, then turned, his expression unreadable. He walked out alone. Luca shifted, his composure unraveling in ways he couldn't hide. Victor let the moment linger, then set his glass down with quiet finality. The Wolves go in tonight. One of his men nodded sharply. Understood. Victor inhaled deeply, the weight of the decision settling into his chest. If this didn't work, there would be no stopping the storm that was coming. Across the city, in a run-down motel room, the air was thick with the stillness of a loaded gun, primed and waiting. Elias sat on the edge of the bed, one boot planted firmly on the floor, the other resting against the creaking wooden frame. His pistol lay in his hands, and his movements were slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic as he checked the slide, the magazine, ensuring every piece was flawless. The air told him everything he needed to know. They were coming, not the reckless, greedy men who chased the bounty, not the fools who'd thought 5 million was worth their lives. These were different. The air always shifted when men like these were near men who'd spent years sharpening their instincts, who moved like ghosts, who killed without leaving a trace. Elias had known Victor would send them. The bounty was never meant to end him, it was meant to slow him, to force him to waste time on small-time killers while Victor schemed to escape the reckoning barreling toward him. But the game had changed. The wolves were here, and Victor wasn't stalling anymore. He was trying to finish it. Elias exhaled, his breath steady, his mind already mapping the angles, the movements, the split-second decisions that would decide whether he walked out of this room alive. They wouldn't rush in blindly. They'd be tactical, coordinated, assuming they had the advantage, assuming he was pinned down, forced to react. That was their mistake. The first strike came like lightning, a sharp, deafening explosion as the door buckled inward, the breaching charge sending a shockwave through the room, splintering the cheap wooden frame and filling the air with dust and debris. The walls shook, and Elias barely had time to move before the first man was inside. Rifle raised, sweeping left with precision. A second followed, covering the right, their movements synchronized, lethal. Elias fired first, the silenced round slamming into the lead man's chest, staggering him just enough. Elias pushed off the bed, driving his shoulder into the second man, sending them both crashing into the flimsy dresser. A third was already through the door, his gun rising, the muzzle flashing as a shot tore through the room. Pain seared across Elias's ribs, a burning line where the bullet grazed him, tearing through flesh just below his vest. There was no time to feel it. The man he'd tackled was already fighting back, his elbow slamming into Elias's side, forcing him to stumble. The room erupted into chaos, a deadly dance of instinct and survival, and Elias Kane was no stranger to it. The wolves had come to hunt, but they'd find no prey here, only a predator, waiting in the dark. Elias Kane barely made it back in time to witness the first attacker spring to life, yanking a combat knife from his belt with a practiced flick of his wrist. The blade gleamed in the dim motel light, slicing through the air with deadly intent. Close quarters, no room for mistakes. Elias moved like a shadow, sidestepping just as the knife whistled past, the edge grazing the fabric of his jacket. His body flowed with the motion, twisting as he drove the butt of his pistol into the man's wrist with a sickening crack. The knife flew from the attacker's grip, clattering across the floor, but the man didn't flinch. His other hand shot up, a brutal fist slamming into Elias's stomach, forcing the breath from his lungs in a sharp wheeze. Pain flared, but before he could recover, the second assailant was on him, a thick arm coiling around his throat from behind, yanking him off balance. Elias hit the ground hard, the impact sending a jolt of agony through his shoulder. His vision swam for a split second, the room tilting as the two men closed in like vultures. One scrambled for the discarded knife, fingers brushing the handle, while the other loomed above, raising a rifle to finish the job. Instinct kicked in, Elias rolled sharply, his boot lashing out to catch the nearest man's knee. The joint buckled with a wet pop, and the attacker staggered, buying Elias just enough time to grab a broken lamp from the floor beside him. With a grunt, he swung the heavy metal base upward, connecting with the rifleman's skull in a bone-jarring crunch. The man crumpled, his weapon skidding across the floor, just as the third attacker lunged, the knife flashing toward Elias's throat. The blade bit into his shoulder, a searing line of pain that tore a grunt from his lips. Blood welled, hot and slick, but Elias was already moving, his hand clamping around the man's wrist with crushing force. He twisted violently, forcing the knife to clatter to the ground, and followed through with a brutal strike to the man's throat, a precise, devastating blow that sent the attacker stumbling back, gasping and clutching at his windpipe. The opening was all Elias needed. He scooped up the fallen rifle, its weight familiar in his hands, and a silenced burst of gunfire cut through the air, ending the threat in an instant. But there was no time to catch his breath. Two more waited outside, their presence a heavy pressure in the silence. They'd heard the fight, the chaos of bodies hitting the floor, and they weren't rushing in like amateurs. These weren't the kind of men who let vengeance cloud their judgment. They were calculating, adjusting, turning the battlefield to their advantage. Elias exhaled, his fingers brushing against the warm blood seeping through his shirt, his side burning where the knife had grazed him. Adrenaline dulled the pain, but it couldn't erase the weight of it, the way every muscle screamed from the fight he'd already endured. He moved quickly, snatching extra magazines from the dead man's vest and reloading as he braced himself against the dresser. His breath slowed, steady, his mind sharpening despite the ache in his ribs and the pulsing heat in his shoulder. Two left. They were waiting, and this was far from over. The motel had fallen eerily quiet, the gunfire replaced by the rhythmic sound of Elias's breathing, each inhale a reminder of the wounds he carried. Blood coated his fingers, some his, some not, the air thick with the coppery tang of violence. He stepped over one of the bodies, his movements deliberate despite the tightness in his chest. The last two hadn't stormed in after their comrades fell. That was the difference between them and the others. They were wolves, not dogs, patient and disciplined. Elias's ears strained for any sound beyond the doorway, but the silence was absolute. They wouldn't come to him. They decided to make him come to them. Fine. His grip tightened on the rifle, muscles coiling as he reached for the door handle. In one fluid motion, he flung it open and stepped into the hall. Weapon raised. The first man was ready, a heavy boot slamming into Elias's gut before he could react. The force sent him crashing back against the motel wall, the rifle slipping from his hands as pain exploded through his core. The second attacker was on him in an instant, grabbing the back of his coat and yanking him forward into a brutal knee strike that drove into his already battered ribs. White-hot agony shot through his side, but Elias didn't falter. As the first man came at him again, an elbow cracked against his jaw, snapping his head to the side and sending the hallway spinning. His vision darkened at the edges, but his body moved on muscle memory, twisting just as the second attacker lunged for a finishing blow. Elias redirected the strike, his forearm smashing into the man's wrist to knock the punch wide. Before the attacker could recover, Elias drove his elbow into the man's sternum, feeling the air rush from his lungs in a strangled gasp. But the first man was back, locking Elias in a chokehold from behind, his forearm pressing against Elias's throat with crushing precision. This wasn't sloppy work, the hold was clean, a blood choke designed to cut off oxygen and end the fight fast. Elias's mind raced, calculating. The grip was too strong to break outright, so he didn't try. Instead, he shifted his weight and threw himself backward, slamming both their bodies into the wall with a thud that rattled the drywall. The grip held, but Elias wasn't done. His fingers found the sensitive nerves above the man's knee, digging in with brutal precision. The attacker's hold faltered just enough. Elias seized the moment, grabbing the man's arm and using his own weight to flip him forward, sending him crashing to the floor. The second attacker was already moving, a sharp hook aimed at Elias's ribs, catching him just enough to send another spike of pain through his body. Elias absorbed it, stepping into the man's space instead of retreating. He trapped the attacker's arm and drove his forehead into the bridge of the man's nose. Blood sprang across the hall as the attacker staggered. Elias pressed the advantage, a vicious strike to the kidney, a sharp knee to the gut, the sound of breath leaving the body in ragged gasps. The first man was back on his feet, lunging with a blade that sliced across Elias's ribs, a shallow but stinging cut. Elias twisted at the last second, grabbing the man's wrist and slamming his head against the wall with a sickening crack. The attacker collapsed, motionless. The second man was barely standing, his face bloodied, his breath coming in shallow wheezes. Elias straightened, rolling his shoulder despite the scream of protest from his body. His eyes locked onto the last man still conscious. The wolf hesitated, wiping blood from his mouth, shaking his head slightly. "I get it now," he said, his voice low, almost resigned. Elias didn't respond. The man nodded, barely breathing. "You really aren't going to stop, are you?" Elias exhaled slowly. No. The man let out a humorless chuckle. Figures. Then he lunged. The final exchange was swift and brutal fists met flesh. Bones snapped, and a body hit the floor for the last time. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. Elias stood there, his breath measured, his ribs aching, his body buzzing with the fading remnants of adrenaline. He ran a hand over his jaw, rolling his shoulders as he stepped over the fallen. The wolves had come for him, and now they were just another message left for the city to find. A faint vibration broke the silence, a low hum echoing against the motel floor. Elias's gaze sharpened, settling on one of the bodies. A phone, clutched in bloodied fingers, glowed softly in the dim light. The screen flashed a name, Victor Saleri. Elias crouched, his fingers closing around the device, his thumb hovering over the screen for a moment before he answered. Yeah. Silence stretched. Then Victor's voice came through, low and steady, carrying a weight that wasn't quite fear but wasn't far from it. Elias. Elias leaned back against the wall, his grip tightening on the phone, his voice quiet but unyielding. Victor. Another pause, heavy with unspoken truths. Victor exhaled through his nose, the sound faint over the static hum of the call. I assume my men are gone. Elias didn't answer. The bodies cooling on the floor spoke for him. Victor let out a slow breath, a faint edge of something frayed in his tone, not fear, not yet, but the dawning realization that the walls were closing in. You've made your point, he said, his voice shifting, reaching for control, for negotiation. The way men like him always did when the ground started to crumble. You want revenge. I understand that. You want Luca. Fine, but we can work something out. It doesn't have to be like this. Elias's eyes narrowed, his grip on the phone steady. The fight was over, but the war was just beginning. Elias let the words hang in the air, their sheer audacity sinking into the silence like a stone dropped into still water. He stood motionless, his grip on the phone unyielding, as if he could strangle the voice on the other end through sheer will. Finally, he spoke, his tone measured but laced with a simmering disbelief. You think this is something we can just talk through? Victor's breath came out in a sharp huff, the first crack in his polished facade. Elias, he said, his voice rising, a raw edge of frustration bleeding through. You think this ends with a handshake, a deal? The words carried a weight that pressed against the quiet, anger clawing its way to the surface. Victor paced now, his footsteps faint but deliberate, his pulse thudding in his ears. His fingers tightened around the phone, knuckles whitening as if he could crush the conversation itself. Elias's voice trembled with something barely contained, a storm of fury and grief threatening to break free. He walked into my home. Victor, he said, each word heavy with the memory of violation. He laid hands on me, took what was mine, and when that wasn't enough, he put a bullet in the last piece of my world. His breath caught, his chest heaving with the weight of loss, his wife, his sanctuary, the loyal dog that had been his final tether to her memory. The pain surged, a tidal wave of everything he'd buried for years, now roaring back to life. And you're telling me we can work this out? Victor didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter, the mask slipping just enough to reveal a flicker of something human. I know what you've lost. Elias. The words were careful, deliberate. Elias froze, his breath sharp, his body tensing as if struck. Victor continued, slower now, each word deliberate. Your wife, your home, the life you fought to build. A pause, heavy with intent. I know what Luca took from you. A bitter, hollow laugh ripped from Elias's throat, sharp and devoid of humor. No, Victor, you don't know. His voice cut through the silence like a blade, each syllable honed to wound. If you knew, you never would have made this call. If you knew, you wouldn't have sent your men to slow me down. If you knew, he spat, his voice rising, you never would have let your son walk out of my house alive. Silence stretched between them, taut and electric. Victor's voice came back, softer but unyielding. He's my son. Elias's breath grew ragged, his jaw clenching so hard his teeth ached. And my wife was my life. My dog was the last shred of her I had. Your son took them from me like they were nothing. Now I'm going to take everything from you. Victor exhaled, a slow, weary sound that carried the weight of a man who'd seen too much. You've torn through every man I've sent after you, he said, his voice steady but tinged with something like resignation. You've burned through my people like they were kindling. And now you want Luca, is that it? Elias didn't answer, letting the silence speak for him. Victor's tone hardened, a spark of defiance breaking through. You can't have him. Elias's grip on the phone tightened, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous murmur. You can't hide him from me. Victor's control fractured, his voice rising with a raw, shaken edge. You think you're the only one who knows how to vanish. I've kept Luca safe from worse than you, and I'll do it again. You can cut down my men, burn this city to ash, but you'll never touch my son. Elias's breath slowed, his body coiling like a predator before the strike. His voice turned cold, lethal. Then you don't understand what's coming. Victor let out a hollow, bitter laugh. You think you're going to stroll into my house, kill my son, and walk away? Elias exhaled, his grip on the phone loosening just slightly, his head tilting as if weighing the question. I don't care if I walk away. The line went silent. Victor's breath hitched, just enough for Elias to catch it, a fleeting crack in the man's armor. When Victor spoke again, his voice was quieter, laced with something that almost sounded like pity. There's nothing left of you, is there? Elias closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, steadying the storm within. His pulse settled into a slow, deliberate rhythm. Not anymore. The call ended with a soft click, the silence that followed heavy and final. Elias stood in the wreckage of the motel room. The phone still clutched in his hand, its screen glowing faintly with the call log. The air was thick with the scent of blood and gunpowder. The bodies of Victor's men strewn across the floor like discarded pieces of a broken machine. His ribs ached, his shoulder burned where a blade had bitten into his flesh. But the pain was distant, irrelevant. His mind was already moving, shifting gears, recalibrating for the hunt. Victor Saleri thought he could protect his son, thought he could bury Luca beneath layers of security and loyalists. He was wrong. Elias had spent years studying men like Victor, men who built empires on fear and power, who believed their name alone could shield them from the world. But no one was untouchable. Not when you dismantled their world piece by piece, brick by brick. Elias moved with purpose, his hands rifling through the gear of the nearest body. His fingers brushed over knives, magazines, a crumpled pack of cigarettes. He took what he needed, a fresh magazine for his pistol, a second tucked into his coat. His body protested with every motion, bruises settling into his bones, but he ignored it. Pain was just noise now, a distraction he'd learned to tune out. He stepped into the bathroom, the cracked mirror reflecting a man he barely recognized. Blood streaked his jaw, his knuckles raw and split. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, gleamed beneath the bruises blooming along his cheekbone. He wasn't the man he'd been years ago, not the husband, not the dreamer who tried to build a life. He was something else now. A hunter, a ghost, a force that wouldn't stop until the job was done. He ran his hands under the faucet, watching the water turn red as it carried the blood away. His mind was already mapping the next steps. Victor would double down now, more men, more defenses, assets moved, loose ends severed. But Victor wouldn't run. Not yet. He still thought this was a game he could win, a war he could outmaneuver with enough bullets and bodies. That was his mistake. The war was already over. Elias was just delivering the final blow. Drying his hands, Elias stepped back into the room, his fingers moving to his phone. He dialed a number he hadn't touched in years. The line ringing twice before a gruff, hesitant voice answered. Who's this? Elias let the silence linger, letting the weight of it settle. Then he spoke, his voice low and even. I need an address. A pause, The voice on the other end exhaled sharply. You know how much heat you're carrying right now? The whole city's watching you. Then they'll see this coming, Elias replied, his tone smooth, unyielding. His fingers tightened around the phone. Victor, I need to know where he is. A longer pause this time, then a resigned sigh. You're not going to stop, are you? Elias's jaw tensed. No. Another sigh, heavy with reluctance. All right, I'll call back when I have it. The line went dead. Elias slipped the phone into his pocket, stepping over the last of the bodies as he moved toward the door. His mind was sharp now, every possibility calculated, every angle considered. Victor had power, but Elias had momentum. Soon he'd have an address, and then nothing would stand between him and the man who'd built the empire that had taken everything. The city could feel it, the shift in the air, the quiet tremor of power changing hands. It wasn't loud, wasn't a declaration carved in neon or blood. It was subtler, slipping into the whispers of those who knew, making cautious men glance over their shoulders, turning allies into enemies who sensed the tide turning. Elias moved through the streets, his body carrying the weight of the fight, ribs aching, shoulders stiff beneath makeshift bandages, but his focus was a blade, honed and lethal. The motel was a memory now, left behind with the bodies cooling on its blood-streaked floor. The echoes of gunfire lingered in the minds of those who'd witnessed the aftermath. Victor's wolves, his best men, had come for Elias and failed. For the first time. Victor Solari wasn't the most feared name in the city. The moment Elias had returned, the underworld had known. They'd watched, waited, weighed the odds. Was the man they'd once whispered about, the legend who'd vanished, still the same, or was he just a ghost, clawing his way back to relevance? The answer was clear now. Elias wasn't a ghost. He was a reckoning. The city had long since stopped pretending it was asleep. Its pulse thrummed through the cracked pavement and flickering neon signs. But it wasn't watching Elias Kane to see if he'd stumble. No, it was holding its breath, waiting to see how far he'd push, how deep he'd carve his path through the shadows that clung to its bones. The ghosts of his past didn't linger, they stalked him, their whispers threading through the humid night air, reminding him of everything he'd lost and everything he still had to take back. Elias stepped into the bar, and the room seemed to exhale. It was the kind of place where secrets were currency, where words stayed trapped behind weathered walls and deals were sealed with a glance rather than a signature. The regulars didn't look up. They knew better than to pry. Elias had been here before, years back, when his life still held the faint promise of escape, when he could still imagine a world where he walked away clean. That version of him was gone now, buried under the weight of too many fights, too many nights spent chasing the one man who'd taken everything. Cal Morrison sat in the back booth, a cigarette smoldering between his fingers, its ember casting a faint glow across his weathered face. His expression was a practiced mask of neutrality as Elias approached, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something doubt. Maybe, or pity. Cal had called an hour ago, his voice low and urgent, saying he had what Elias needed. Now, as Elias slid into the booth across from him, Cal looked like a man wondering if he'd just handed a lit fuse to a bomb. "You look like hell," Cal said, exhaling a slow plume of smoke as he flicked ash into the tray beside him. His gaze lingered on Elias, taking in the faint bruise blooming along his jaw, the way his shoulders stayed taut despite the ache he must have been carrying. Elias didn't flinch, his eyes locked on Cal's. "Where is he?" Cal tapped his cigarette, the sound sharp in the quiet. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a murmur. "Victor's holed up tight, got security at every door, eyes on every street corner around the place. He's running low on bodies. But don't mistake that for weakness. He's not desperate, not yet." Elias let the words settle, his mind already mapping out the next move, calculating angles and risks. Cal hesitated, his fingers pausing over the cigarette. "You sure about this, Kane?" Elias's jaw tightened, a faint pulse of tension rippling through him. "I'm not asking twice." Cal sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. He slid a folded piece of paper across the table. its edges worn like it had been handled too many times. Safe house. Not one of his usual spots. He's keeping Luca close, but he's not letting anyone in or out unless they're on a short list, and that list is shrinking fast. Elias unfolded the paper, his movements steady despite the dull ache in his ribs. The address stared back at him, along with a rough sketch of the layout scribbled in the corner. Cal had done his job. As always, Elias tucked the paper into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the fabric as if grounding himself against the weight of what came next. Cal leaned back, his eyes narrowing. This isn't just about you anymore. You know that, right? The city's watching. They've seen the bodies you've left behind, the way you've torn through Victor's empire. They're waiting to see how this ends. Elias exhaled, the sound slow and deliberate. Then they won't wait long. Cal muttered something under his breath, shaking his head. You're really going after him, aren't you? Elias met his gaze, his voice like iron. I was always going after him. For a long moment, Cal just stared, then nodded, grinding out his cigarette in the ashtray. You're gonna burn it all down, Kane. Elias didn't blink. It's already burning. Cal stood, slipping his hands into his pockets as he stepped away from the booth. He didn't say another word, didn't need to. Elias lingered for a moment longer, the city's weight pressing against him, its jagged edges sinking into his skin. Then he rose, rolling his shoulders to shake off the stiffness, his mind already fixed on the path ahead. The city knew the tide had turned, and before dawn broke, Victor Salieri would know it too. The streets stretched out before him, a labyrinth of flickering lights and forgotten corners. Tonight, the city didn't hum with life, it waited, its buildings looming like silent sentinels, its alleys emptied as if in anticipation. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone felt it, the men still loyal to Victor, the ones whispering his name in fear. And soon, Victor himself. Elias stood on the rooftop's edge, his breath steady despite the ache in his chest, the dull throb in his shoulder. His body bore the scars of every fight that had brought him here, but pain was just noise now, drowned out by purpose. Only one thing mattered, the safe house in the distance. Its iron gates, the final wall between him and the man who thought himself untouchable. He scanned the perimeter, his eyes tracing the guards' movements, the way they shifted their weight, their hands tightening on their weapons, their gazes darting into the shadows. They were on edge, bracing for an attack they knew was coming, but they weren't looking in the right places. Elias moved, his steps silent against the rooftop as he dropped to the estate's shadowed edge, blending into the darkness that clung to the stone walls. He stayed low, watching, waiting for the moment their attention flickered. Then he struck. The first guard fell without a sound. His body eased to the ground before he could react. The second followed, then the third, each taken down with swift, calculated precision. By the time the others sensed something was wrong, it was too late. A guard turned, his breath catching, his hand fumbling for his weapon, but Elias was already there, closing the distance in a heartbeat. He disarmed the man with a single motion, the guard's body hitting the ground before he could cry out. The others barely registered the threat before Elias overwhelmed them, his movements a blur of controlled violence. They were trained, but they weren't ready for him. Elias exhaled, his grip steady on his weapon as he stepped past the fallen guards, his eyes fixed on the estate's heavy doors. Inside, Victor waited. This wasn't about vengeance, not yet. Luca, Victor's son, was still out of reach, hidden somewhere only Victor could reveal. Elias rolled his shoulders, ignoring the sting in his ribs, and pressed forward. The hunt was nearly over, and there was nowhere left to hide. The estate was a tomb, its silence thicker than the night outside. The air held the stillness of a place where power had already crumbled, where the last defenses had fallen, where the man at its heart had no one left to command. Victor Salieri's empire was collapsing, and for the first time in decades, he wasn't the one pulling the strings. Elias stepped into the office, the doors swinging open with a force that announced his presence before he ever spoke. The chandelier's dim light cast jagged shadows across the bookshelves, the air heavy with the scent of cigar smoke and aged whiskey. A glass of liquor sat untouched by Victor's elbow, a hollow gesture at control. Victor didn't rise, didn't reach for a weapon. He just sat there, his fingers lightly clasped, his eyes fixed on Elias with the calm of a man who'd seen this moment coming for years. But Elias knew that look, the thin veneer of composure stretched over the first cracks of fear. He stopped in front of the desk, his gaze cold, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Where is he?" Victor exhaled, tilting his head, his tone too smooth, too practiced. "And what happens if I tell you?" Elias's grip tightened, tension coiling through his shoulders. "Where is he?" Victor chuckled, a low, hollow sound, shaking his head. "You think this ends with Luca? You think you just walk away after this?" Elias didn't move, didn't blink. Victor's smile was sharp, knowing. "No, it doesn't." The words barely landed before Elias struck. His fist connected with Victor's jaw, the impact snapping his head to the side, his chair lurching from the force. Victor gasped, his hand clutching the desk's edge, his mask slipping for a fraction of a second before he steadied himself, blinking through the daze. Elias didn't pause. He grabbed the whiskey glass and hurled it against the wall, the shatter echoing like a gunshot, the sharp scent of liquor flooding the room. Victor barely flinched, but his eyes betrayed him the flicker of realization, the understanding that this wasn't a negotiation. Elias leaned in, his hands braced on the desk, his voice low and unyielding. "You sent your men after me. You put a bounty on my head. You watched me tear through every layer of your empire to get to your son. And now you sit here pretending you still have a say. Let me make this clear." "Victor," his voice dropped, the room seeming to shrink around them. "You don't?" Victor exhaled, the faintest trace of amusement fading from his face. "You're already gone, aren't you?" Elias's jaw clenched, his breath steady. Victor licked the blood from his lip, his gaze heavy. "I knew what you'd do the moment Luca took from you. I knew how far you'd go. I still tried to stop it." His voice softened, almost reflective. "And you know why?" Elias didn't answer. Victor's eyes held his, unyielding. "Because I thought I could still win." Elias seized the edge of the desk, his muscles straining as he heaved it over with a furious roar. The heavy oak crashed against the floor, splintering on impact, sending papers fluttering like startled birds, and the whiskey bottle shattering into a cascade of glass and amber liquid. Victor barely had time to shove himself back, his chair skidding across the floor, before Elias was on him. With a swift, brutal motion, Elias yanked Victor from his seat, slamming him against the wall with such force that the framed paintings rattled violently. One crashing to the ground, Victor grunted, the air driven from his lungs, his body stiffening as Elias pinned him, an arm pressed hard against his throat. Elias's voice was a low, dangerous growl, stripped of all patience. "Where is he?" Victor coughed, his breathing ragged, his hands clawing at Elias's iron grip, trying to wrench himself free. But Elias was unyielding, his strength fueled by a relentless fury. "You think this will get you answers?" Victor rasped, his voice strained yet clinging to a flicker of defiance, a remnant of the control he once commanded. Elias didn't flinch. He slammed Victor back against the wall again, harder, the impact reverberating through the room. His voice dropped to a chilling whisper, each word deliberate, heavy with intent. "No, but I'll tear apart everything you've got left." Victor's breath hitched, his body tensing under the weight of Elias's words, the unspoken promise behind them. Elias leaned closer, his voice barely audible but laced with venom. "I'll burn your empire to ash. I'll dismantle every piece of what you've built. When I'm done, no one will dare stand in your shadow. You won't just lose Luca, you'll lose everything." The silence that followed was suffocating, a thick tension coiling between them. Victor exhaled, his shoulders sagging just enough to betray the cracks in his resolve, his defiance unraveling under the crushing inevitability of Elias's threat. "The docks," he muttered, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. Warehouse 17. Elias held him there a moment longer, his gaze piercing, reading the subtle shifts in Victor's posture, the resignation settling into his features. There was no deception, no hidden trap, just the raw truth. Releasing his grip, Elias stepped back, watching as Victor slumped against the wall, one hand rubbing his bruised jaw, his sharp intake of breath cutting through the quiet. Elias turned toward the door, his body still taut with the aftershocks of their confrontation, his mind already racing ahead to the next move. Victor's voice, low and almost broken, stopped him. "You know they're waiting for you." Elias paused, his hand on the doorframe. Victor exhaled, shaking his head, his tone quieter now, almost resigned. "It won't matter." Elias didn't respond. He stepped into the shadowed hallway, the darkness swallowing him as he moved toward the docks, toward the final chapter. Luca had nowhere left to run, and before the night was through, this would all be over. The night air hung heavy with the briny tang of salt and the sharp bite of oil, the distant rumble of cargo ships a low hum against the stillness of the waterfront. The water stretched out beyond the piers, a vast, inky expanse, its surface catching the glow of overhead floodlights in fractured, shimmering fragments. Every so often, a ripple broke the illusion of calm, but there was no peace here, only the tense anticipation of what was to come. Elias stood at the edge of the container yard, his body carrying the weight of every step that had led him to this moment. Bruises throbbed deep in his ribs, each breath a dull ache, and the gash on his shoulder burned with every movement. But pain was a distant thing, irrelevant. Exhaustion clawed at his muscles, yet it had no hold on him now. Luca was close. Ahead, Warehouse 17 loomed, its rusted metal walls a grim barrier between Elias and the end of his hunt. The structure was ancient, built to store shipments long since forgotten. But tonight it was a fortress, a cage for a man who had run out of places to hide. Elias exhaled slowly, steadying his breath, his eyes scanning the perimeter. Victor's forces were depleted, reduced to a ragged handful of enforcers clinging to the remnants of a crumbling empire. They lingered near the entrance, their movements jittery, their eyes flickering toward the shadows, hands gripping their weapons with desperate tension. They knew who was coming. They were afraid. Elias moved like a specter, silent and unseen. The first guard didn't even have a chance to react before Elias was upon him, his approach soundless until it was too late. A swift, precise strike, his hand closing around the man's collar, dragging him into the darkness before a sound could escape. A brief struggle, a sharp gasp, then silence. One down. The second guard turned, his instincts sharp but a fraction too slow. Elias met him head-on, deflecting a frantic attempt to raise a rifle, his own blow landing faster, sending the weapon skittering across the ground. A second strike dropped the man in a heap. Two. The third guard, finally realizing the danger, fumbled for his radio, his voice breaking through the static in a panicked whisper. But Elias was already there, his movement swift and decisive, silencing him before the warning could take shape. Three. Elias exhaled, his pulse steady despite the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. The warehouse doors loomed ahead, their rusted surface scarred by years of salt and weather. The handle was slick under his fingers as he pushed forward, stepping into the cavernous interior. The air inside was thick with the musty scent of dust and forgotten cargo. The dim flicker of overhead lights casting jagged shadows across the concrete floor. Stacks of weathered shipping crates lined the walls, their silhouettes looming like silent sentinels. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of cautious footsteps echoed against the metal walls. Luca was here, hiding, but not for long. Elias followed the sound, his senses sharp, tracking the subtle signs of panic, the scrape of a shoe against the floor, the sharp intake of breath when a crate shifted too loudly. Luca wasn't built for this. He'd been handed power without earning it, given protection without understanding its cost. Now, with no one left to shield him, he was unraveling. Elias's voice cut through the silence, calm but commanding. "You can come out now." The stillness stretched, taut and heavy, before a shaky voice answered, strained but trying to cling to some semblance of control. "You don't have to do this." Elias let the words hang, let the silence press against Luca, amplifying the weight of what was coming. Then, his voice low and steady, he replied, "Yes, I do." A sudden shuffle broke the quiet, desperate footsteps, the sound of someone scrambling to reposition, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Elias moved toward the noise, rounding a stack of crates, his eyes locking onto the figure pressed against the warehouse wall. Luca's face was pale under the faint light, his jaw clenched, his hands trembling around a pistol he barely knew how to hold. His breathing was erratic, his body rigid with fear, the gun shaking in his white-knuckled grip. Elias stood motionless, his gaze unyielding. Luca swallowed hard, his voice cracking as he tried to hold on to something already lost. "You don't have to do this," he repeated, his eyes darting frantically, searching for a way out, for anything to change what was coming. "My father, he's finished. You've won." Elias took a single step forward. Luca flinched, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Don't come closer," he shouted, his voice breaking. Elias stopped, his expression unreadable, his eyes never leaving Luca's. The younger man's breathing was too fast, his body trembling under the crushing weight of fear, the pistol growing heavier in his hands with every passing second. Elias exhaled, his voice calm, deliberate. "You were never meant for this world. Luca." Luca's fingers twitched against the gun, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "It was just a car," he stammered, his voice desperate, grasping for an excuse that no longer mattered. Elias tilted his head slightly, his tone carrying a quiet finality that left no room for argument. "No, it wasn't." Luca's chest heaved, his mind racing, trapped between fight and flight, his body caught in a moment where control had slipped away entirely. Elias waited, patient, unyielding. Luca's voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible, trembling with the weight of his fear. "Are you going to kill me?" Elias's breath slowed, his body steady, his mind clear. He didn't hesitate, didn't waver, didn't lie. "Yes." The distant sound of waves lapping against the docks was faint, muffled by the steel walls of the warehouse, swallowed by the heavy silence that hung between them. The air was cold, thick with the scent of salt, rust, and the stale dust of a place long abandoned. Luca stood several feet away, his back pressed against the wall, his hands gripping the pistol so tightly his fingers looked drained of blood. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, his body caught in the paralyzing tension of a man who had run out of options, out of time. Elias moved slowly, his steps measured, deliberate, his breath steady despite the aches pulsing through his body, despite the exhaustion burning in his muscles. The hunt was over. The chase had ended. All that remained was this moment, this final reckoning. In the dim, flickering light of the warehouse, Elias Kane stood like a shadow carved from stone, his eyes locked on Luca Salieri. Luca's hands trembled, clutching the pistol as if it were the only thing tethering him to the world. A thin sheen of sweat glistened on his brow, his chest heaving with uneven breaths. The air between them crackled with the weight of desperation, a fragile thread of control fraying with every second. Luca shifted his weight, trying to stand taller, to project something other than the cornered prey he resembled. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice quivering, the words stumbling out as his grip tightened on the gun, its heft seeming to grow heavier in his hands. Elias took a deliberate step forward, his movements slow, almost predatory, yet calm. "Neither did you," he replied, his voice steady, cutting through the tension like a blade. Luca's breath hitched, his head shaking as if he could deny the truth staring him down. "I didn't know who you were," he stammered, his fingers twitching against the pistol's grip, his body taut with fear. Elias's gaze didn't falter, his eyes cold and unyielding. "But you knew what you were doing." Luca's words spilled out faster now, frantic, as if speed could make them true. It was just a car, he insisted, his voice cracking under the strain. Elias's response was quiet, but it carried the weight of a verdict. It was never about the car. Luca swallowed hard, his mind racing, grasping for any lifeline to pull him from the suffocating inevitability closing in. "My father's done," he pleaded, his voice raw. "You got what you wanted. You don't have to do this." Elias stepped closer, his presence looming. "Your father isn't the one who broke into my home." Luca froze, his breath shallow, his pulse visibly hammering in his throat. Elias could see it all, the rigid grip on the gun. Too tight, too unsteady, the uneven stance. Weight shifted wrong, betraying a man who'd never been trained for this moment. Luca had lived his life shielded by his father's name, by men stronger than him, by power he hadn't earned. But now, stripped of those protections, he faced the consequences alone. "Is this justice?" Luca asked, his voice fraying, clinging to a thread of defiance that was already unraveling. Elias exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. "No, justice would have stopped you before you ever crossed my threshold." Luca's jaw clenched, his hand tightening on the pistol, his breath sharp and ragged. "Then what is this?" he demanded, fear bleeding into every syllable. Elias took another step, close enough now to see the sweat beading on Luca's forehead, the way his shoulders sagged under the weight of his own terror. "This," Elias said softly, "is what happens next." In a flash of desperation, Luca's body moved before his mind could catch up. The gun jerked upward, the motion clumsy, panicked. But Elias was faster. His arm shot out, deflecting the weapon with a swift strike, his other hand seizing Luca's wrist and twisting hard. The pistol clattered to the concrete floor, skittering into the shadows. Luca stumbled back, his hands raised, trembling, his breath coming in short, frantic gasps. He was caught between fight and flight, with nowhere left to run. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Elias didn't hesitate. His fist connected with Luca's ribs, a precise, controlled blow that sent him staggering, his breath escaping in a broken gasp. Another strike followed, efficient and unrelenting, driving Luca to his knees, his body curled inward, hands weakly pressing against the cold concrete as if it could anchor him. Elias stood over him, his breathing steady, his shoulder rolling as he watched the last traces of defiance drain from Luca's face, leaving only raw fear. Luca looked up, his hands shaking, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You don't have to do this." Elias's response was calm, final. "I already did." The final strike was swift, deliberate, a single, precise motion, devoid of anger or hesitation. The silence that followed was deafening, an absolute void that swallowed the warehouse whole. Elias stepped back, inhaling deeply, letting the moment settle. The ache in his ribs pulsed, the weight of exhaustion tugging at his limbs, the lingering pain of every fight that had led to this moment pressing against him. But none of it mattered now. The hunt was over. He turned toward the exit, stepping out into the night, leaving the empty warehouse behind, leaving Luca Salieri as nothing more than a fading echo in a city already moving on. The docks were quiet, the air thick with the scent of salt and the distant hum of cargo ships. To Elias, the world felt silent, the weight of his actions settling into his bones, each step a reminder of the toll this war had taken. The city would feel it soon. The absence of Luca Salieri would ripple through the underworld, a stone cast into still water. Victor Salieri had built an empire on wealth, violence, and fear. But tonight that empire had cracked, its foundations shattered by something inevitable. Elias moved through the shadows between shipping containers, the pain in his ribs sharpening with each breath, exhaustion creeping into his vision. The fight had carved deeper into him than he'd admit. But there was one last task to finish. The low roar of an engine broke the silence, tires screeching as a black sedan skidded to a stop at the edge of the docks. Elias kept walking, his pace deliberate, his body coiled, his mind already bracing for what came next. A car door slammed, heavy boots hitting the ground. "Kane." The voice cut through the night, deep and raw, laced with something close to grief but sharper, more dangerous. Elias didn't stop. Another door opened. More footsteps. Then the unmistakable click of a gun's safety being released. I said stop. Elias slowed, tilting his head just enough to catch the glint of streetlights on metal a gun, raised with intent. He turned to face Victor Salieri, who stood a few yards away, his coat heavy on his shoulders, his fists clenched. Shadows cloaked his face, but his jaw was tight, his lips pressed into a thin line, his body radiating something colder than fear or anger, something final. Two enforcers flanked him, their weapons trained on Elias, but they were mere remnants of a crumbling empire, barely worth a glance. Victor inhaled sharply, his gaze locking onto Elias with an intensity that burned. "Do you even know what you've done?" he asked, his voice low, trembling with barely contained rage. Elias studied him for a long moment before answering, his voice quiet but firm. "Yes." A bitter laugh escaped Victor, hollow and devoid of humor. "You think this changes anything?" He took a step closer, his boots heavy against the pavement. "You think taking my son undoes what happened to you? You think this brings her back?" Elias's fingers flexed at his side, a small but deliberate movement. "No." Victor's expression darkened, something raw and frayed coiling behind his eyes. "Then what was the point of all this?" Elias didn't hesitate. "The point was that he never should have walked into my home." Victor's breath caught, his head tilting slightly as he took another step, the distance between them shrinking. His voice dropped, heavy with disbelief. "All of this?" For a dawn, the words hung in the air, sharp and cold, pressing into the silence. Elias's jaw tightened, his breath steady, his voice cutting like a blade. "It was never just a dog." Victor's gaze flickered, a fleeting crack in his composure, but he recovered quickly, his expression hardening. "You're a fool. Cain, you think you're different from us. You think you're not the same man you were before all this." Elias didn't move, didn't react. Victor's voice lowered, almost thoughtful but laced with venom. "You killed my son." Elias met his gaze, unflinching. "Yes." Victor exhaled slowly, deliberately, his eyes burning with a cold fury. "And now I kill you." The tension shattered, the air igniting like a spark in a pool of gasoline. Victor moved first, his gun rising with lethal intent, but Elias was already in motion, his body a blur of instinct and precision, ready to meet the final challenge of a war that had already cost him everything. The night was alive with tension, the air thick with the scent of salt and the distant hum of a city that seemed to hold its breath. Elias Cain stood at the shadows of the docks, his pulse steady, his eyes sharp, watching as Victor Salieri's men advanced. Their hands gripped their weapons with practiced ease, their steps deliberate. Each movement honed through years of discipline, but Elias had been waiting for this moment, had been carrying it in his chest since the night they ripped his world apart. His body reacted before his mind could catch up, instinct overriding thought, hesitation, or doubt. His hand darted to the pistol at his hip, his stance shifting, muscles coiling like a predator, ready to strike. The first shot split the night, a sharp crack that echoed across the harbor. Victor's men scattered, their silhouettes fracturing in the dark as bullets tore through the air. The roar of the ocean a relentless backdrop to the chaos. Elias moved with lethal precision, dodging to the left and slipping behind a stack of weathered crates. His breath was measured, his focus razor sharp. This wasn't an ambush or a desperate escape, it was the end game. Victor had come to settle a score, to avenge the son he'd lost. But Elias Cain wasn't a man who lost. The docks erupted in gunfire, the sharp reports slicing through the stillness, the acrid tang of gunpowder mingling with the briny air. The world beyond the harbor felt like a memory, the city's lights flickering in the distance, indifferent to the collapse of an empire unfolding here. Every step Elias took was deliberate, every motion calculated. His body ached with the weight of exhaustion, but his mind was a blade, cutting through the chaos with brutal clarity. Each bullet he fired found its mark, not wasted in reckless fury, but placed with devastating intent. The first of Victor's men fell before he could even process the fight, his body crumpling to the pavement, eyes wide with shock. The second was tougher, his training evident in the crisp efficiency of his movements. But training alone couldn't match the relentless will of a man forged in blood and loss. Elias dispatched him with a single, clean shot, the man's weapon clattering uselessly to the ground. Victor Salieri himself moved with the cold, controlled fury of a man who had ruled for decades, a king who had never imagined he'd be brought to his knees. His gun was steady, his posture unshaken, but Elias could see the subtle signs of strain, the faint tremor in his fingers, the uneven rhythm of his breath. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a desperate bid to claw back a legacy slipping through his grasp. Elias ducked behind a steel container, bullets sparking against the metal, the impacts ringing in his ears as Victor's men tried to flank him. They had numbers on their side, but numbers had never mattered against a man who didn't know how to stop. Sliding low along the ground, Elias moved before they could pin him down. One of Victor's men rounded the corner too quickly, expecting Elias to still be pinned behind cover. The mistake was fatal. A single shot to the chest sent him sprawling, his body hitting the pavement with a dull thud. Two remained. Elias pressed forward, his movements fluid despite the pain flaring in his ribs, his mind locked on the next step. Another of Victor's men fired, the bullet grazing Elias's arm, tearing through fabric and drawing a thin line of blood. He didn't flinch. Closing the distance, Elias disarmed the man with a swift strike, then drove a brutal elbow into his jaw. The force sent the man crashing into a crate, unconscious before he could hit the ground. Only Victor remained. The old crime lord stood near the edge of the loading dock, his heavy coat draped around him like a mantle of faded glory. His gun was raised, his posture resolute, but his eyes betrayed the weight of a man watching his empire crumble. Elias stepped forward, the space between them charged with the gravity of everything that had led to this moment. The harbor's low hum was the only sound, the city beyond a distant witness to the blood spilled here. Victor's breath was slow, deliberate, his expression unreadable. "You could have walked away," he said, his voice low, steady. Elias took another step, his own voice calm but unyielding. "So could you." Victor let out a short, hollow breath, almost a laugh, but it carried the bitterness of a man staring down his own end. "You think this makes you different from me?" Elias didn't respond, his silence heavier than words. Victor nodded, as if piecing together a truth he'd been too late to grasp. "You're no different. You just needed a reason." Elias exhaled, his body loose despite the tension crackling between them. "Maybe." Victor's grip tightened on his gun, his eyes glinting under the dim glow of the dock's overhead lights. "Then let's finish it." Without warning, Victor fired. Elias moved, the bullet whistling past him, missing by a fraction as he raised his own weapon and returned fire. The shot hit Victor, a sharp impact that drew a grunt of pain. The older man stumbled back, his hand clutching his side where blood seeped through his coat, but he didn't falter. He raised his gun again, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with something deeper than anger grief. Defiance, the refusal to let his story end. Elias surged forward, closing the gap before Victor could fire again. Another shot grazed his shoulder, pain flaring hot and bright, but he didn't slow. He slammed into Victor, their bodies crashing against a rusted shipping crate, the weight of decades of power, betrayal, and war fueling their struggle. Victor fought with the precision of a man who had survived countless battles, landing a sharp blow to Elias's ribs, then another to his jaw. The impacts rattled through him, but Elias absorbed the pain, twisting Victor's wrist until the gun slipped from his grasp, clattering to the pavement. Neither reached for it. This was no longer about weapons. Elias drove his knee into Victor's side, sending him staggering. But the old man recovered with a speed that defied his years. He lunged, his fists cutting through the air, each strike a testament to a life spent fighting for every inch of ground. Elias blocked, countered, his elbow catching Victor's ribs with enough force to make him stagger. But Victor pressed forward, driving them both toward the dock's edge, the cold night air sharp against their skin as the city loomed in the distance. For a moment, they were locked in silence, their breaths ragged, their bodies straining in a fight neither could afford to lose. Then Victor spoke, his voice quieter now. Raw, you killed my son. Elias's grip tightened, his own voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. He killed my wife. Victor's breath hitched, his expression darkening as he summoned the last of his strength, his hands pressing against Elias with desperate force. Then I guess we both lose. The fight wasn't over, not yet. The night closed in around them, the dock silent except for the sound of their labored breaths, the slow drip of blood on concrete, the distant hum of a city that didn't care. Elias held Victor's wrist, feeling the stubborn resistance of a man who had built an empire only to watch it unravel. They stood at the edge of the dock, the black water below reflecting the flickering streetlights above. Victor's breath was uneven, his body racked with pain, but his eyes still burned with defiance. You've torn everything apart, he rasped, his voice thick with exhaustion, blood staining his lips. For what? Elias studied him, seeing the lines etched deep in his face, the sharp intelligence in his gaze now clouded by the realization that there was nothing left to fight for. No power, no men, no legacy. For her, Elias said, his voice quiet but resolute. Victor let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. You think she'd be proud of this? Elias's jaw tightened, the weight of every fight, every scar, every moment of grief settling into his bones. No, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But I didn't do this for pride. The night stretched out around them, the weight of their reckoning heavy in the air. Two men, bound by loss and vengeance, stood at the edge of everything, their paths converging in a moment that could only end one way. The night hung heavy, thick with the weight of finality. As Victor's eyes flickered, a subtle shift in his stance betraying the storm brewing within him. Something unspoken pressed into the air, a tension so palpable it seemed to hum between them. His fingers twitched, then curled into a tight fist, and in a flash, he lunged. His strike swift and desperate, aimed at Elias's ribs. It was a last-ditch effort, a final bid to claw back control before everything he'd built came crashing down. But Elias was always a step ahead. He'd seen the move before Victor's body even fully committed, his own frame already shifting, his arm twisting to redirect the force. With a fluid motion, he pressed forward, forcing Victor back, the soles of Victor's boots scraping against the gritty concrete as his balance faltered for a fleeting moment, just enough. That sliver of time was all Elias needed. In an instant, the momentum shifted. His counterstrike was precise, brutal, a sharp twist of his body that sent Victor staggering backward, his breath hitching as pain bloomed in his chest. The realization hit Victor before his body could catch up. This was the end. His knees buckled, and Elias released his grip, letting him stumble until his back slammed against the rusted hull of a cargo container. Victor slid down, collapsing against the cold steel, his breath shallow, his strength ebbing away. His fingers pressed against the wound in his side, blood seeping through, staining his coat and pooling beneath him in slow, dark rivulets that gleamed faintly under the dockside lights. The fight was over. The empire Victor had forged decades of ruthless ambition, of crushing anyone who dared stand in his way, was finished. He exhaled, his body sagging further, his head tilting as he looked up at Elias. His eyes, once blazing with the fire of dominion, now held something quieter, stripped bare of the legacy he'd fought so hard to protect. A faint smirk tugged at his lips, bitter and resigned. Was it worth it? He rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. Elias stood over him, rolling his shoulders to ease the ache of exhaustion settling into his bones. His own breath came slow, steady, as he watched Victor's chest rise and fall in uneven, faltering movements. It was never about worth, Elias murmured, his voice low, carrying the weight of conviction. It was about making sure you could never do it again. Victor let out a weak chuckle, his head shaking slightly. his breath ragged. You think you've changed anything? Elias tilted his head, his expression unreadable, a mask of resolve. No, he said simply, but I ended something. Victor's final breath slipped out, a slow, resigned sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his entire existence. His body stilled, the fire in his eyes fading into the cold night air. And just like that, Victor Solari, kingpin, tyrant, architect of an untouchable empire, was gone. Elias stood there for a long moment, the silence pressing in around him, the absence of Victor's presence almost tangible. The city would feel this loss, its underworld trembling in the wake of what had happened here. Factions would scramble for the scraps of Victor's empire, some fighting to claim his throne, others crumbling in the chaos of the power vacuum. But to Elias, none of it mattered. Not anymore. He turned, stepping away from the docks, his breath steady despite the pain radiating through his body. His mind was already elsewhere, drifting to a place far from the city's reach. The road stretched endlessly before him, winding through silent woods. The headlights of his car cutting through the darkness like a blade. The city was a distant memory now, left to whisper his name in hushed tones, Elias Kane, the man who'd brought down an empire. Some would wonder if he was still out there, a specter waiting in the shadows. But Elias was done with their world. The weight of exhaustion clung to him, old wounds aching with every breath, but his focus was fixed on what lay ahead, a place that had always called him back. No matter how far he'd run, deep in the heart of the forest, untouched by time, stood the cabin. Its weathered wooden frame was strong, resolute, a quiet sanctuary amidst the towering trees. The air was crisp, laced with the scent of pine and damp earth. The only sound, the soft rustle of wind through the branches. Elias stepped out of the car, his breath visible in the cold night air, his movements deliberate, each step heavy with the gravity of a man who'd finally reached the end of a long, brutal journey. Behind the cabin, where the trees stretched high and the world felt still, was the grave. It had stood there for years, marked by a weathered headstone, the name etched into it, softened by time, but forever clear, Lillian Kane. Elias approached slowly, his gaze settling on the stone, his breath catching as memories unraveled in quiet waves. For so long, he'd run from this place, from the pain of what had been taken from him. But now, standing here, the rest of the world felt distant, irrelevant. Only this remained. He knelt beside the grave, unzipping the duffel bag at his side with careful hands. His breath was steady, his focus on the task rather than the grief pressing against his chest. From the bag, he lifted a wrapped bundle, its weight heavier than it should have been, carrying the burden of years. Gently, he laid it beside the grave, the body of the dog, the last piece of the life he'd lost. The earth had already been prepared, the soil loose beneath his fingers as he placed it down, giving it the rest it deserved. His hands lingered, his eyes tracing the stillness, the finality of it all settling into him like a quiet tide. He exhaled, reaching for the first handful of dirt, letting it slip through his fingers, each grain carrying the weight of every moment that had led him here. The grave was filled in silence, no words, no prayers, just the steady rhythm of his hands and the quiet of the night. When it was done, he sat back, his gaze fixed on the fresh soil, his hands resting on his thighs. From his coat, he pulled a small, worn collar, its tag still gleaming faintly under the moonlight. His fingers traced the engraved name, softened by time and touch, a relic of a life that had been stolen from him long ago. He pressed it into the earth beside the headstone, letting it rest where it belonged. For a long moment, he sat there, the weight of the past pressing into him. Then his voice broke the silence, rough and quiet, carrying the exhaustion of a man who'd spent years fighting for something that could never be undone. "It's over," he said, the words dissolving into the night, swallowed by the trees and the cold air. He inhaled deeply, closing his eyes, letting the moment settle, letting the past finally rest. When he opened them, the world was still, the grave silent, the weight of his burdens lighter than it had been in years. He stood, his gaze lingering on the headstone for just a moment longer before he turned, his footsteps soft against the earth. The cabin waited in the distance, its door unlocked, its windows glowing with the warmth of a place that had once been home. The city would never forget him. His name would echo in alleyways, in whispered tales of deals and betrayals, in stories of the man who'd brought down Victor Solari and paid the price for it. But Elias Kane was done. As he stepped through the cabin's door, leaving the past buried where it belonged, the world outside moved on without him. For the first time in years, he let it.